We are so excited to welcome McKenna Kelly, a tech reporter for Wired. I just read your latest, McKenna, from the convention. It's a Hotties for Harris World, and we're just living in it. About a party I want you to tell us about that happened at the convention that I was really sad I missed because I was exhausted and it was early in the week and I knew it was a marathon, but I heard it was very lit. So thank you for joining us. And yeah, tell us about the party and what sort of it represented in terms of the moment and the vibes, if you will, at the Democratic National Convention.
Yeah, and it's great to be here. I went to that party all last week as soon as I got to the DNC in Chicago. Everyone was talking about this Hotties for Harris party that was going to take place on Tuesday. It was going to be the big, fun party. All these content creators were going to be there, but then also, just people could come. There were campaign staffers there, all this kind of stuff. And the people who threw it were telling me that it was like a creator activation event. And, when you talk about activations in the influencer space, it's kind of just like things that they can take pictures of and do and, videos and produce content. And so I was expecting kind of what I saw, but when I walked into the venue, it was like the Museum of Ice Cream for libs. It's just a bunch of all these little places for them to take videos. There was a whole board that said Hotties for Harris, merch, a giant screen in a dance floor that had like the heads of Kamala and Tim Walz bouncing around. And, as the night progressed, it got pretty full. People seemed like they were very excited to be there.
Yeah, no, I still have FOMO that I missed it, but it's so interesting because kind of what you're describing too. It's like a photo booth, right? Prompt that like giving content creators, and content creators are playing a massive role in this election. I think on both sides, on all sides, if you will, they have become the most powerful marketing sort of figures and tools and tactics for campaigns and for organizations doing this work to get out the vote. And I'm curious, everything has changed so much, and TikTok is one of the most powerful platforms and will be one of the most, if not the most powerful information distribution channel that shapes the outcome of this election. And yet TikTok has a political and advocacy advertising ban. So you can't actually advertise if you're the Harris Walz campaign or the Trump campaign, or target specific audiences the way that you can on Meta or other platforms like campaigns do. So it really is an organic kind of platform and strategy. And that's where content creators are so important. And I'm curious, how do you think that that is playing out or will play out in terms of not being able to measure the impact, but like where things stand on both sides, the Trump side versus the Harris Walz side, in terms of kind of organic engagement and energy on TikTok and other platforms?
Yeah, I think, when we look at TikTok, the political ban, we look at Instagram and Meta, Facebook, et cetera, banning, not amplifying political content anymore, creators have really become the replacement for that. Because at the same time, campaigns are still trying to reach these niche audiences. Maybe, with Facebook targeting with ads, it was specific demographics, specific zip codes. And now it's specific content in a specific audience that watches it. And so you have people like Jeremy Jacobowitz, who I met last week, who is a food influencer. And why is a food influencer at the DNC? Well, it's because he has a huge audience, and these are people who traditionally wouldn't have been met by CNN or the New York Times or anyone like that. So it's Jeremy with this huge audience of people who otherwise, wouldn't have been reached, getting this message directly from the DNC. And so to get at the changes from 2020 and ad targeting, I think the creators have really been a supplement to that for a lot of campaigns. Now, how both campaigns are using them is very similar, but I think that the Democrats are doing more work on those niche audiences of people and finding specific groups. Like I did a big project where I looked at some of the most major, largest creators on both sides of the political spectrum. And when you look at the right side, they have a lot of huge creators, people with gigantic audiences. Just recently, Logan Paul and Jake Paul, who, grew to fame on Vine and were YouTubers, been around for a while. Now they're a pro boxer and a pro wrestler. They just recently talked to Donald Trump. Trump was on the Impulsive podcast. He was on Aiden Ross's show, who's another like hyper masculine creator with a huge audience. And so at the same time that the Democrats are kind of hyper targeting creators, I think, when you look at Trump, they're trying to reach this mass audience of people who at times when you look at these audiences are like kind of this hyper masculine type of audience.
Well, it's certainly been a sea change. I mean, look, every 4 years the technology changes, campaigns have to adapt to the opportunities they have. But it seems like the innovation that we've seen just in the last few months, going from the Biden campaign to the Harris campaign, it feels from where we sit that there's been sort of that the campaign's been sort of unleashed, right? That they've had far more freedom to dive into this new world than they had before. Part of it is that they have a candidate who can sell into this world, who's very charismatic and can pop. But there's also been a huge change, I think, in attitude, right, from the campaign itself and an embrace of sort of a new, edgier style, more edgier language. I mean, reflect about since you've been covering this from Biden now to Harris. What is the sense that you've gotten about what you've seen about how it's evolved in the last couple of months?
Dark Brandon was funny initially.
Mhm.
And it got a little cringy and people got tired of it because guess what? It wasn't authentic to Biden. It just wasn't authentic to Biden. And so when you look at someone like Kamala Harris, who at the time was entering, when she jumped into the presidential race, there had already been a moment created with her for her with the Charlie XCX brat stuff. She was just popping off with the coconut stuff on TikTok. And there was this moment that I think she really rallied in that wasn't like putting her directly in the conversation, like her doing like the Apple dance or whatever. That isn't what Kamala was doing. Instead, there was these brief acknowledgments of what was happening online, but letting the people online, these communities of people who already were having fun, just go with it, right? And I think that's what has really helped the campaign in a lot of ways, which is they're not trying to inspire and create these viral moments themselves, really. They're kind of just egging on and encouraging people who are doing it themselves
Yeah, and
online.
that I mean that's a testament to just the organic grassroots energy around her. Like everybody just being excited, producing content, finding old clips, pushing it out there where the campaign doesn't have to. And when you have that enthusiasm gap, you have to try hard. And when you try hard, that's cringy, right? That's the exact opposite of what works on organic engagement. So it makes sense. And I'm curious because you're reporting on this election through the election, and this is such still kind of like the wild west of not understanding how much these vibes are going to turn into votes, where they're going to turn into votes. Are you seeing anything really kind of interesting and novel that either campaign is doing that you haven't yet reported on yet, but are sort of starting to look into? Related to kind of trying to actually translate the energy that we're experiencing for the Harris Walz campaign online into actual votes.
I think the really smart thing that the Kamala campaign did was realize that this viral moment will end at the beginning of launching her campaign, realizing that, they needed to capitalize on this quickly. And then you also had like the grassroots people, like the white dudes for Harris, all this stuff. Instead of just like letting this moment continue on and fizzle out, they've given these people the tools to actually get involved through election day. And doing that at that critical moment, right? When everything was most viral and most popular and really popping off. You had Jake Tapper on CNN learning what brat summer meant, all that kind of stuff. It was a huge moment and capitalizing on that and giving the people the tools. And I think that's kind of, I think also just the campaign's willingness to work with a bunch of other groups. On Tuesday night, the Swifties for Harris people who, as soon as Kamala started running for office, for the presidential campaign, they gathered together and the campaign has actually supported them. They've contacted them, given them materials and tools. And I think, that engagement and making it be like a two-way street has been really helpful in their space
Yeah, and
for the
Taylor Swift
Democrats.
hasn't even endorsed anyone yet, but the Swifties for Harris are out there strong.
It is, it is amazing all this, and in part it gets back to the fact that I think Kamala Harris, comes from California, the tech and media capital of the United States, the cultural powerhouse of California. I mean, as a statewide elected, these kinds of things were not distant from her. I mean, she lived in Los Angeles with her husband. I mean, this is where she spent a lot of time. And I think the fluency she had, despite, not being a kid, right, in all these things, has enabled the campaign to really go. She let go. I mean, she was comfortable. I mean, her embracing Beyonce right away, right, was this sort of cultural moment that was really powerful, I think, in terms of creating an identity around her, distinction from Joe Biden, but also an identity around her. And I think people forget that, coming from California, she's really steeped in a lot of these things in a way that other people wouldn't have been in the day-to-day culture of the state. And I think that one of the things that you said I just wanted to reflect on was that the other thing that the Harris campaign has done is that they've asked, to your point, they've given permission and explained that they believe that the action of citizens will be critical for her success. She's created a permission structure for people to take action on her behalf. When we fight, we win. All that language around the importance of individual actions has encouraged, I think, all this creativity, similar to what we saw in '08, right? I mean, I think a lot of the most powerful moments in Obama were organic, coming from outside of the campaign. And you're really seeing this now on a level. I mean, every day I'm getting people sending me drawings, videos, right? There's been an explosion of citizen generated organic content that is unlike anything that I've ever seen. And I'm wondering, how you think this is going to, I think it's increasing. I think the amount of activity every day is increasing as people sort of see others and are challenged by others. I mean, Nick Offerman just had this wild, incredible, organic video that he just released yesterday. I think he's now already done a second version. It's been so viral. So reflect a little bit about how you think this is all going to play out given just the sheer volume, because I think it's going to encourage not just influencers, but very famous people now to start to really create their own content for her and not to ask for permission from the campaign, but just to go do it themselves.
The platforms are there. With TikTok and vertical video, I think a lot of people in the space have now learned that it's part of their job. Even myself, like when I first started in journalism, how many years ago, I just wanted to be like Thomas Pynchon. Nobody saw my face, they just knew my byline, but that's not what we have anymore, right? You have to be more than this black serif font on a newspaper. And I think, with news media, I've learned that I need to do vertical video and play in this space. And now I have more experience in it than I did before. And I think everyone is learning that this is how you engage with politics, with culture, with all of these, things that happen online, and it happens through video. And I think, seeing that you can just put something online and become a moment, become a news headline, become all of these things is really inspiring to maybe, small people might, like people who just have a couple thousand followers, or people who, are just big supporters of Kamala posting on their personal Facebook page. And then, of course, people like Nick Offerman and people who are huge celebrities.
And Simon mentioned Beyonce briefly in the role of her song Freedom in the Kamala campaign. And it made me think about, we all three just got back from the Democratic National Convention in Chicago and lived through, again, viscerally, how rumors and misinformation can spread very quickly, as it did for the last day of the convention. There was a rumor that gained a lot of traction that Beyonce was going to come perform and that she'd even done a sound check, and all the different, details that were out there that ended up to not be true, or, pretty alarming. But disinformation does and has always played a role in elections. We know both with foreign interference from Russia and China, which we've seen again, but also just from right-wing media and Trump and his campaign itself spreading disinformation, misinformation. And we've been in this world in obviously different ways, McKenna, for a long time. So we've seen, both the reaction to 2016 and Russian interference with all the platforms building different teams and tools to be able to monitor and deplatform accounts and disinformation and bad actors, to then rolling a lot of those policies back and getting those teams and resources and tools over the past few years. So I'm curious, how do you think disinformation and misinformation is going to play out online in this election? To the degree, what do you think we're seeing right now? And what do you think the platforms ultimately will do about it, if anything? Are they going to throw up their hands and kind of, claim that they don't have a role or responsibility, or are you seeing them start to actually do more in response to disinformation online?
Yeah, like you mentioned, we had the big tech layoffs over the past couple of years, and an area that was really hit was the trust and safety teams at Meta, Facebook, X, and Elon Musk basically just eradicated that team entirely. And so, fortunately, we haven't seen anything that has played such a huge role, like the Hunter Biden laptop and things like that, that drove news cycles in the last election. There was the Biden robocall in New Hampshire. That was a big one of people, thinking that this random robocall was actually Biden, when it was actually a magician in New Orleans working on behalf of the Dean Phillips campaign, which is like nuts. So, I think what people are really discussing now is, I saw some headline this morning about some accounts, people who were influencers having their photos taken from their accounts and being used to be people on Twitter spreading misinformation and support about Trump. So I think AI, and like creating these false identities, and AI helps like misinformation, disinformation get travel across, at scale. People can make this content at scale, especially if it's photo and video content. There are rules that Facebook and X and things have about fact checking these videos and fact checking this stuff. But like we saw in 2020 and in 2016, the platforms often don't move fast enough, especially when they do, even when they did have the teams in place for all of this. There was still, the drunk Nancy Pelosi video that wasn't an AI thing in 2020, but it was actually, just a slowed down video that anyone probably could have done in iMovie. And so I think, there hasn't been too much as of yet. But I think as we get closer, right, that is going to be the time where people, bad actors, will really start to fan the flames.
That's right. And we also know, like, when they don't have a factual argument that is sticky or gains traction, they just create them on the right. And so,
Or or even with AI now, AI is being more used as a tool to discount real information, right? You've seen the Trump campaign and other people point to something that is just like an actual photo that was taken and saying, oh, it couldn't be, this was an AI image. And so I think maybe that right now, I've seen so much more of that than I've seen, AI generated content actually tricking
right.
people
And it's just
online.
planting a seed for people like, oh, maybe that wasn't real. And then that's all they have to do. You can't go the record at that point. That's what they count on.
You know, Tara, it's really interesting your question because it is amazing how late we are in the cycle without there having been some kind of really major
I mean, I'm
event
not,
around this. Yeah, no, given our expectations, right? I mean, and
yeah,
but part of that is that I think that the best way to counter disinformation is by being loud yourself, right? To create to take up the space so it's harder for these kind of this negative viral moments to catch on. And I think the loudness of the Harris campaign, for all the things we've just been discussing, has been a central reason why it's been much harder for these kinds of mis and disinformation campaigns to work. But I do think the desperation that it now exists in Trump, because I think we are winning this election now and we are ahead, and Trump is feeling it in ways that it's going to incentivize them to sort of get wilder and more crazy and to use more extreme tactics. And I assume that in coming months, but I'll just tell you, in my own Twitter feed, I've had very, very little attacks, negative engagement, because I think that the people that are behind all this stuff, the bad actors, as McKenna calls them, have still don't exactly know what to do, right? They haven't completely I think the Trump campaign itself is still flat-footed and flummoxed and hasn't really understood how to engage with this new powerful Kamala Harris campaign. But it's going to come. I mean, it's going to come and it's going to come soon. I mean, their big negative advertising campaign begins any day now. I mean, where they're going to start dropping stuff. And my assumption is there's going to be massive amplification around crime and race and immigration. I mean, these issues where they always go, where Elon Musk has been living, frankly, and himself in the last few months. But I think the question I also just wanted to throw out there was that, we've seen a couple really interesting things happen in the last few weeks. We saw Dmitry Simes's house, who's considered to be a Russian spy in the United States, get raided by the FBI. We saw now the head of Telegram, right, get arrested over wild charges in France in the last few days. It does feel like the governments of the West are a little bit more on the front foot on this stuff and are trying to do what they can. There was that huge takedown, right, of Russian sites just a few months ago. It feels like the governments are a little bit more on their front foot, and trying to really combat these kinds of systemic bad actors, as you call them. Is there anything that you're hearing, McKenna, about this? I mean, is there any sense that you get that our government and the Western governments are being a little bit more aggressive than they've been in the past?
Sure. Well, I think they've had a lot of time to learn, right? In 2020, they were caught on their back foot and they didn't really understand what can, all these things that can happen online and how people in, Russian disinformation, Chinese misinformation that we're seeing even more now, although it hasn't been all that persuasive, according to a lot of reports that I've recently read. Yeah, I think, they're being a lot more aggressive on it because they just have background and they know a lot more how to chase it, right? Now, back to one of the points that you made earlier about our X feeds. When we talk about disinformation and misinformation, I think we all here spend a lot of time on Twitter, X, when really a lot of disinformation and misinformation are across all these different platforms. And a big driver of the misinformation on X in 2020 was Donald Trump's Twitter feed. And Donald Trump hasn't been using Twitter since he was basically removed in 2020 after 2021 after January 6th. But now we're seeing him back on the platform. Ever since that conversation with Elon Musk, I've been debating, when do we write the story that Trump is back on Twitter? Because he's slowly been, putting those, all caps tweets that we're used to, yelling into the void of his so many millions of followers. And I think, that has Trump being back on Twitter also has the potential for some kind of change or, engaging with false information online, or at least encouraging it and bringing it back to that platform in a way that hasn't been there over the last couple
Yeah,
of
and this
years.
could be a whole separate conversation in an episode, but it's so interesting because I've always thought like Elon Musk was so jealous of the power that Trump grew on Twitter. He bought the platform and he replaced Trump as the super spreader of disinformation and misinformation on the platform he now owns and operates. And we know that that has had actual real implications abroad in elections and other issues, and expect that he will continue to play a role to kind of sow disinformation and mistrust on his own platform here too. So I'm kind of so grateful that you joined us for our very first episode of Closing Strong, and hope we can chat again before the end of the election and hear what you're seeing on the internet.
Of course, this is really fun.
Thanks,
Thank you
McKenna.
all.